For a little more than 30 years, there was one city on this continent where the rules did not apply. While the United States was pouring its whiskey into the gutters, and Ontario was locking its bar doors at 7 in the evening, this city kept its lights burning until dawn. You could drink here when drinking was a crime everywhere else. You could gamble here, in back rooms that ran all night and never seemed to close. You could buy almost anything, and almost anyone, if you knew which door to knock on and who to pay once it opened. They called it the wide open city. They called it the Paris of North America. And in whispers, in newspaper headlines, in the sermons of the men who wanted it destroyed, they called it something plainer than that. They called it Sin City. For 3 decades, Montreal sold the rest of the continent the pleasures the rest of the continent had banned. It grew rich on that trade. It built one of the great fortunes in the history of the country on it. Trains ran north out of New York and Boston, packed with men who had money and a thirst and a weekend to lose, and Montreal was waiting for every one of them, open all night, smiling, taking its cut at every door they walked through. And then a fired policeman, a stubborn young lawyer, and an old judge spent 4 years inside a courtroom, proving exactly how the machine worked, who was paid, how much, and by whom. And when they were finished, they buried it. This is the story of how a city turned its own sins into an empire, how the openness that made it the playground of half a continent was, underneath the neon, a vast and patient system of protected crime that reached all the way into City Hall and into the police station itself. And it is the story of how the men who finally tore that system apart used its destruction to climb, and how, almost without meaning to, they helped bring an end to Montreal's long reign as the greatest city in Canada. This is the entire story of the real Sin City of North America. But before we go any further, I have a small favor to ask. We work incredibly hard to dig up these forgotten chapters of history and rebuild them piece by piece. The places, the fortunes, and the people that time tried to erase. But looking at our analytics, the vast majority of you watching right now are not subscribed. It costs you nothing, and it takes about 2 seconds, but it makes an enormous difference in keeping this channel alive and growing, so we can keep bringing these stories back from the dead. So if you want to see more of the history the world left behind, take a second and hit that subscribe button right now. Thank you. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a cold river and a city that learned, very early, exactly how to sell what travelers wanted. Everything that Montreal became begins with the river, and with a single stubborn fact about it. The St. Lawrence is the great door into the heart of the continent, the water road that runs from the Atlantic deep into the interior of North America. But just as that road reaches the island where Montreal sits, it breaks. A stretch of violent water, called the Lachine Rapids, cuts across it. A churning barrier, too fast and too shallow for an ocean ship to pass. For centuries, that was where the journey stopped. A vessel coming up from the sea could go no further. Everything, and everyone, had to come off the water here, at the foot of those rapids, and be carried onward by other means. That is the whole foundation of the city. Not ambition, not beauty, not the accident of a fine mountain rising behind the harbor. Geography. Montreal exists because it is the place where the continent's traffic was forced to stop, unload, and change hands. When French settlers founded a small missionary and fur-trading outpost on the island in the middle of the 1600s, they were planting themselves at exactly that break in the river, and the settlement grew into the great hub of the North American fur trade for the same reason. Everything gathered here before it moved on. It became the great port of Canada by the simplest logic imaginable. It was the last place a ship could reach, and the first place a cargo had to be sold, stored, or moved. And a port, above all other kinds of town, learns one lesson faster than any other. A port sells travelers whatever travelers want. This is the single fact from which the rest of the story descends. For generations, Montreal was a city of arrivals and departures. Sailors came off the ships with wages in their pockets, and no reason to save them. Soldiers of the British garrison that took over the city after the conquest filled its taverns. Fur traders, rivermen, merchants, and laborers passed through in their thousands. A city like that, built on transience and appetite and money, that wanted to be spent tonight rather than kept for tomorrow, does not grow the same conscience as a quiet inland town. It grows a trade in pleasure, because pleasure is what its customers are buying. Long before anyone called it Sin City, Montreal already had its taverns and its gambling, and its well-known district, where the older trade in sex was carried on, tolerated as a permanent feature of a busy port. The habit was already old. The scale was simply about to change. For the better part of a century, this was simply understood to be the nature of the place. A great port and a great commercial city drew a great deal of money and a great many restless men. And where money and restless men gather, the trades in drink and chance and sex follow as surely as night follows day. Reformers railed against it. Churches preached against it. Every so often a wave of moral panic would sweep through, and a few houses would be raided, and a few arrests would be made. And then the wave would pass, and the district would quietly reopen, because too many people wanted what it sold, and too many people profited from selling it. The city had worked out a kind of settled understanding with its own vices. A truce arrived at over generations, in which the trade was tolerated so long as it stayed in its assigned quarters and paid its unofficial dues. It was not yet the machine it would become, but every part it needed was already in place. The appetite, the district, the tolerance, and the quiet habit of paying the right people to look away. All it lacked was a reason to grow enormous. And in 1920, across the border, that reason arrived. And there was a second fact, layered on top of the first, that made Montreal different from every other city in the country. It was a divided city, and no single authority ever fully governed its soul. This was the metropolis of French Catholic Canada, a culture that had never taken to the grim, teetotal temperance that swept the Protestant, English-speaking parts of the continent. Here, wine and a glass of something strong were part of ordinary life, not a moral emergency. But Montreal was also the great English commercial capital, the home of the country's biggest banks and its railway empires, home to the Anglo-Protestant businessmen who did, in their churches and their reform societies, preach the gospel of temperance and order. Two peoples, two moral codes, two languages that often did not listen to each other. Neither side was ever able to impose its will completely on the other. And in the gap between them, in the space where no one was entirely in charge, a certain kind of freedom took root and quietly flourished, or a certain kind of corruption, depending on who you asked. By the 19th century, Montreal had also become the industrial heart of the country. When engineers finally dug a canal to carry shipping around the Lachine Rapids, the banks of that canal filled with factories and mills and the crowded working districts of the laborers who ran them, and the city swelled into the largest and richest in Canada. It was the headquarters of the great railway that bound the young country together. It was the seat of its financial power. It was, for as long as anyone could remember, the first city of the nation, the place where the money and the traffic and the ambition of Canada all came together. And underneath that respectable prosperity, running quietly through the same streets, was the other Montreal, the port town Montreal of taverns and back rooms and tolerated vice, waiting for the moment it would be handed a market larger than it had ever dreamed of. So, by the early years of the 20th century, the pattern was already set. Montreal was the largest and richest city in Canada, the funnel through which the country's traffic and trade poured, a wet and worldly island in an increasingly dry and Puritan continent, governed by a divided establishment that had learned to look away from the things that made it money. The taverns stayed open. The gambling houses did their quiet business. The brothels operated in their own well-known districts, tolerated, taxed in their own unofficial way through the pockets of the men who were supposed to shut them down. It was not yet an empire. It was just a city that knew how to sell what travelers wanted and had never seen a good reason to stop. And then, across the border, a law was passed that would take that ordinary vice and hand it the single greatest gift it would ever receive, the thing that turned Montreal from a wide-open town into the wide-open capital of a continent did not happen in Montreal at all. It happened in Washington. On the 16th of January, 1920, the United States of America went dry. Under a new amendment to its Constitution and the law that enforced it, the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol became illegal across the entire country, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, in every state and every city. Overnight, tens of millions of Americans were forbidden by their own government from doing something they had done freely the day before. The saloons were shuttered, the breweries were padlocked, the distilleries went silent. An entire nation's thirst was driven underground into the speakeasies and the bathtub gin and the hands of the criminals who were only too happy to supply what the law had forbidden. But a thirst that size does not simply vanish because a government wills it. It goes looking for the nearest place it can still be satisfied. And when tens of millions of thirsty Americans looked north, across a border that was little more than a line on a map, they saw one great glittering exception to the new order of things, because Quebec had refused to go dry. This is where the whole future of the city turns. In the years around the First World War, the temperance movement had swept across Canada just as it had across the United States. Province after province voted itself dry. For a brief moment, even the federal government imposed a wartime prohibition on the whole country. But when the decision was handed back to the provinces, Quebec broke ranks. In a referendum in 1919, the province voted to keep beer and wine and cider legal, rejecting the full prohibition that its neighbors had rushed to embrace. Quebec would be the wet province in a drying nation. And a short time later, rather than banning liquor outright, the province did something far cleverer and far more lucrative. It took the trade over. It created a government commission to control the sale of alcohol, one of the first arrangements of its kind on the continent, and turned the province's thirst into a steady, respectable stream of public revenue. While the rest of North America was throwing its bottles into the gutter, Quebec had decided to sell them, legally, under the seal of the state itself. The effect on Montreal was immediate and enormous. It was now the largest, liveliest, most sophisticated city in the nearest wet territory to the great dry cities of the American Northeast. It was a short train ride from New York, from Boston, from the whole thirsty industrial heartland of the United States. And so they came. They came for the weekend and for the long holiday. They came off the trains at Windsor Station and stepped into a city where the bars were open and legal and loud, where a man could order a drink without lowering his voice, where the whole atmosphere of forbidden pleasure that the American speakeasy had to hide behind a locked door and a password was simply, gloriously, out in the open. Montreal did not have to pretend. That was its magic. It was the place where you could be free of the law without breaking it. The hotels filled. The restaurants filled. The cabarets, soon, would overflow. An entire tourist economy bloomed almost overnight around a single fact, that this was the nearest place a dry nation could come to get wet. And where the tourist's thirst was the doorway, the real fortunes were made in the flood of liquor that ran the other way, south, across that same easy border, into the parched and profitable American market. Because Prohibition had not killed the American desire to drink, it had merely made drinking a crime, and crime, as always, was where the largest money lived. Somebody had to supply the speakeasies of a whole continent. The liquor came down out of Canada by every route a determined smuggler could devise, in fast boats across the lakes and down the rivers, in cars with hidden compartments running the back roads into Vermont and New York. in shipments that vanished across the line and reappeared in the glasses of Manhattan. And some of the people who did that, trade best, and profited most, ran their operations out of Montreal. The whole border became a kind of open secret, a line that everyone crossed and no one quite respected. Convoys of cars ran the dark country roads down into Vermont and upstate New York, their springs sagging under the weight of the bottles hidden inside them. Fast boats slipped across the lakes and down the river valleys under cover of night. Whole shipments moved south by rail and by truck, vanishing at the line and surfacing again in the speakeasies of the American cities, as if by magic. It was a vast, improvised, wildly profitable trade, and Montreal sat near the top of it, one of the great wet reservoirs from which a dry nation quietly drank. And the traffic ran both ways, because the same border that carried the liquor south carried the tourists north. To the parched cities of New England and New York, the very word Montreal took on a glow of forbidden promise. The name of the place you went to do the things you could no longer do at home. It meant liquor, and music, and women, and long nights that did not end. Travel agents sold the weekend. The railways ran their trains full, and ran them often. And the men who stepped off at the station were not gangsters or desperados for the most part. They were ordinary Americans, businessmen and clerks and husbands on a spree, who had simply discovered that a single night's journey north bought them back the freedoms their own government had taken away. Prohibition had drawn a hard line across the middle of a continent, and Montreal had positioned itself, brilliantly and profitably, on exactly the right side of it. For the 13 years that the great American experiment in enforced virtue ground on, the city grew fat on the appetites its neighbor had outlawed, and when Prohibition finally ended, and the United States turned its own taps back on, the fortunes that had been made in Montreal did not vanish with it. They had been earned, legally, on the Canadian side of the line, and they had been earned on a colossal scale, large enough that the greatest of them would endure for generations as respectable, established wealth. The thirst of a forbidden continent had been quietly converted into permanent riches. It was the perfect illustration of the city's whole genius. Montreal had not created the vice. It had simply understood, faster and better than anyone, how to stand in the open doorway and take its cut as the appetites of a continent came pouring through. Enter Samuel Bronfman, a hard, brilliant, relentlessly ambitious man whose family had come to Canada as poor Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe and clawed their way up through the hotel trade and the mail-order liquor business on the western prairies. When the United States closed its distilleries, Samuel Bronfman and his brothers understood, faster and more clearly than almost anyone, exactly what that meant. There was now a nation of tens of millions who could not legally make the thing they desperately wanted, sitting right next to a country that could make it freely. In the early years of Prohibition, the family ran export houses near the western border, selling liquor that crossed south into the United States, a trade so raw and so lawless that one of their own relatives was shot dead at a lonely rail siding during it. Then, Samuel Bronfman moved the whole enterprise east, to Montreal, and built it into something vast. He formed a great distilling corporation, built a major distillery on the edge of the city, and acquired an old and respected Canadian whiskey house to give his empire its name and its brands. From that base in Montreal, the family assembled one of the largest liquor operations in the entire world, and one of the greatest private fortunes ever made in Canada. The Bronfmans operated, carefully, on the legal Canadian side of the line. They made the liquor, and they sold it, and what happened to it after it crossed into the dry United States was, officially, someone else's business. But everyone understood where the ocean of Canadian whiskey pouring into American speakeasies was coming from, and everyone understood that the fortune being built in Montreal was built, at its foundation, on the thirst of a forbidden continent. This is the hinge of the whole story. The liquor was the beginning. It was the great river of money that flowed into the city and washed everything else into motion. Because once the Americans were already coming north for the drink, Montreal learned, very quickly, that it could sell them everything else as well. The whiskey opened the door, and through that open door came the entire trade in vice that would give the city its name. Around the flood of liquor and tourist money, an entire infrastructure of pleasure rose up, organized, protected, and enormously profitable. At its heart lay a district everyone knew and no one officially acknowledged, a zone of streets in the lower part of the city where the older trade in sex had always concentrated, and which now swelled to meet the appetite of a continent. This was the red light district, spread through the blocks around the great central boulevard the locals simply called the Main, and along the side streets that ran off it. The brothels here were not hidden in shame. They were open businesses in a well-mapped part of town, their locations known to every cab driver, every hotel clerk, every traveling salesman, and, crucially, every policeman on the beat. A visitor did not have to search. He had only to ask, and half the city could give him directions. The scale of it was industrial. This was not a handful of discrete houses, but an entire district given over to the trade, block after block of it, operating year after year in plain view of a police station that knew every address by heart, and the whole of it paid. There was, in effect, a tariff on vice, an unofficial but thoroughly organized system in which each house and each game contributed its regular share to keep the raids away. Collectors moved through the district on their rounds the way a landlord collects rent, and the money climbed the ladder from there, share by share, into the pockets of the men who had agreed to look the other way. Everyone in the arrangement understood the price of doing business, and everyone paid it, because the alternative, to operate without protection, was to be shut down inside a week. What made it so durable was that it served everyone who mattered. The house owners got to operate in peace. The officers who were paid got a steady private income far beyond their wages. The city got the tourist money, and the tax on the liquor, and the golden reputation that pulled the crowds north. And the ordinary citizen, unless he went looking for it, could walk past the whole vast machine every single day and never quite have to see it. A system that profits everyone and troubles no one has enormous staying power. This one had held, in one form or another, for the better part of a generation, and to the men who ran it, there was no reason on earth to imagine it would ever end. That was the assumption beneath all of it, and it was about to prove fatal. Alongside the brothels ran the gambling, and gambling, in Montreal, was not a few furtive card games in a basement. It was an industry. There were the barbot houses, running a fast and merciless dice game late into the night, the money moving across the tables faster than the eye could follow. There were the betting shops that took wagers on horses running at tracks 1,000 miles away, the results wired in over the telegraph almost as they happened. There were rooms full of men and money in the backs of cafes and the upper floors of ordinary-looking buildings all over the downtown, each one paying its way, each one part of a network that stretched across the city. To a visitor stepping off the train, it looked like freedom, like a city that had simply decided to let its people enjoy themselves. But it was not freedom. It was a machine, and like every machine, it had operators, and the operators took a cut of everything that moved through it. This is the part of the story the postcards never showed. The wide-open city did not run on tolerance and good humor. It ran on an arrangement. The brothels and the gambling houses and the after-hours clubs could only operate so openly because the people whose job it was to close them had agreed, in exchange for money, not to. Payment flowed upward, from the individual house to the collector, from the collector into the pockets of policemen on the beat, and, the reformers would eventually prove, further up still, into the ranks of the men who commanded the force and the officials who ran the city. It was a system of protected crime, and the protection was its most valuable commodity. A gambling house without protection was raided and shut. A gambling house that paid was left alone, night after night, year after year. And so the real power in the underworld belonged not to whoever owned the most tables, but to whoever controlled the arrangement itself. Enter Harry Davis, one of the men who sat near the center of that arrangement for years. Davis was a gambling boss, a hard operator, who had risen through the city's underworld to control a substantial share of its illegal games. He was the kind of figure the whole system ran through, a man who decided who could open, and where, and on what terms, and who collected when they did. For a long stretch of the wide-open years, to do business in the Montreal underworld meant, in one way or another, coming to terms with men like him. He was proof of a simple truth about the machine. Its most important product was not vice, it was permission. And in a city where permission was worth a fortune, permission was also, eventually, worth killing for. Because here is the thing about a city that runs on an arrangement rather than on the law. As long as everyone is being paid, everyone is happy, and the arrangement looks eternal. The house owners are rich, the collectors are rich, the protected policemen are comfortable, the tourists are delighted. No one inside the machine has any reason at all to want it to stop. That is exactly what made it so strong, and, in the end, exactly what made it so fragile. A city held together by shared corruption is only ever one honest man away from exposure. But in the roaring, prosperous years, there did not seem to be any honest men in a position to matter. And besides, the money was not only in the brothels and the dice tables. The most dazzling money, the money that gave the city its glamour and its legend, was up on the stages, under the lights, in the greatest nightlife the continent had ever seen. Picture St. Catherine Street, on a Saturday night, near the end of the 1940s. It is well past midnight, and the city is more awake than it was at noon. The great boulevard runs bright and loud into the dark in both directions, lined with electric signs, marquees stacked with the names of clubs and revues and orchestras, the light spilling out across wet pavement, and the roofs of the taxis idling 3 deep at the curb. The cold does not empty these streets. Men in heavy overcoats and women in furs move between the doorways in a steady current, their breath clouding in the winter air. And from every second entrance comes a wall of sound, a big band swinging hard, a piano under a spotlight, a crowd roaring at a comedian or a dancer. The trains from the American cities have been arriving all evening, and their passengers are loose and laughing now, spending the money they came north to spend, because there is nowhere back home they can spend it like this. Step through one of those doors, and the city shows you its true genius. Montreal in these years was one of the great entertainment capitals of North America, a city whose nightclubs and cabarets rivaled anything in New York or Chicago, and which had one thing those cities could not offer under Prohibition, and never quite matched even after it. The city never closed. There was the grand supper club glamour of the big rooms, with their orchestras and their chorus lines, and their tuxedoed crowds. There were the rowdier houses, and the after-hours joints, where the real night began only when the respectable places were shutting their doors. There were clubs whose names became famous across the continent, drawing the biggest touring performers in the business, and where a visitor could sit a few feet from a star, who back home would have been playing to a hall of thousands. All of it ran late, and much of it ran all night, in a city that had simply decided the sun coming up was no reason to stop the music. And in the district around Saint-Antoine Street, in the black neighborhood the city knew as Little Burgundy, an extraordinary jazz culture had taken root, nourished by the railway porters and the working families who lived there, and by the constant flow of American musicians, drawn to a city that welcomed them when much of the continent did not. Out of those few blocks came some of the finest jazz musicians the country would ever produce, artists raised on the sound, pouring out of the clubs that ran until the small hours. And one young pianist from that neighborhood would grow up to become one of the most celebrated jazz musicians in the entire world. The corner where the great clubs of the district stood was, for a generation, one of the beating hearts of the city's nightlife. Enter Rufus Rockhead, a Jamaican-born Montrealer who had worked as a railway porter and moved liquor during Prohibition before he opened, on a corner in that same district, a nightclub that became one of the most celebrated jazz rooms in the country. His club ran for decades, its bands and its dancers and its late crowds a fixture of the city's nightlife, a place where the biggest names in jazz played to rooms that stayed full long after every respectable establishment in the rest of North America had gone dark. He was one of many. The city was thick with clubs, some grand and some grimy, some of them fronting for the gambling and the arrangement that ran beneath them, all of them part of the same glittering, sleepless economy of pleasure. To walk the entertainment districts on a busy night was to move through a city that had turned pleasure into its principal industry. There were the great cabarets with their full orchestras and their elaborate floor shows, pulling touring stars down off the American circuit to play rooms where the audience sat close enough to touch them. There were the jazz rooms where the music ran until dawn and the finest players on the continent sat in with one another in the small hours. There were the burlesque houses and the gambling clubs and the little after-hours joints down the side streets where the real regulars gathered, only once the bigger rooms had closed their doors. And threaded through all of it was an entire working population of the night, thousands of them. The musicians and the dancers and the waiters, the bartenders and the doormen and the cab drivers, the croupiers and the collectors, people who slept through the daylight and came alive when the sun went down, because the sun going down was when their city truly opened for business. It was, for a time, one of the genuine nightlife capitals of the world, spoken of in the same breath as the greatest cities on earth. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that gave Montreal its particular magic, was that all of it sat out in the open. There was no need here for the password and the peephole and the constant fear of the raid that defined the American speakeasy. Here the door was simply open, the light spilling out onto the pavement, the music audible from the street. A whole city that had decided, collectively, that the night belonged to whoever wanted it. To the visitor drifting happily from one lit doorway to the next, it felt like the freest place on the continent. He was not meant to notice that the freedom had an owner and a price, and that somewhere above the lights, in an office he would never see, someone was carefully counting the take. And on the more scandalous stages, the city offered its most notorious attractions. The burlesque theaters of the downtown drew enormous crowds to their revues, and one performer in particular became, for a time, the very symbol of the wide-open city. Enter Lily St-Cyr, an American dancer whose elaborate striptease act at a downtown Montreal theater made her one of the most famous and most talked about entertainers on the continent. She packed the house night after night. She was eventually hauled into court on a charge of offending public decency, and the case became a public sensation. An argument carried out in the newspapers over exactly how wide open the wide-open city was allowed to be. She was acquitted. Of course she was. This was Montreal, and the whole point of Montreal was that here, the show went on. To the rest of the continent, watching from behind its locked doors and its early closing times, all of this looked like one thing: freedom. A city that had simply decided to let its people live. And that reputation spread until Montreal's name became a kind of shorthand for pleasure without limits. A legend that pulled in ever more visitors and ever more money in a self-feeding cycle. But up close, from inside, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a machine, humming with a precision that had nothing to do with freedom. Every stage and every table and every brothel plugged into the same network of collection and payment and protection. The lights were real, the music was real, and so was the cut that somebody, somewhere, was taking from all of it. Just how far the legend of Sin City reached is difficult to overstate, and it is worth pausing here on one particular piece of that legend, because it reveals something important about how the real power in the city actually worked. Ask people, even now, who ran the Montreal underworld in its wildest years, and a certain famous name tends to come up. The story goes that Al Capone himself, the most notorious gangster in America, ran liquor and rackets through Montreal, that the great Chicago boss had his hand deep in the wide-open city. It is a good story. It is almost certainly not true. Here the tale usually leans forward, and it is worth slowing down instead. There is no solid evidence that Capone operated in Montreal in any meaningful way, and the popular image of the celebrity American gangster, secretly pulling the strings of the city, gets the real machine almost exactly backward. The power in Montreal was not imported from Chicago. It was local, and it was quiet, and it was far more durable than any single flamboyant boss. The fortunes flowed to Canadian export houses, like the Bronfmans, who supplied the American thirst from the legal side of the line and grew rich beyond imagining. The rackets on the ground belonged to homegrown operators like Harry Davis, and increasingly, as the years passed, to a rising local organization with its own deep connections to the great crime families of New York. Enter Vincenzo Cotroni, known as Vic, a figure who would come to embody the maturing of the Montreal mob. Over the decades, Cotroni consolidated much of the city's organized crime and bound it tightly to one of the most powerful mafia families in New York, turning Montreal into an important northern outpost of the American underworld, a hub for the movement of money and contraband up and down the eastern seaboard. This was the real architecture of power, and it tells you everything about the machine. Sin City was not run by a visiting legend from Chicago who dropped in for a headline. It was run by its own patient, well-connected men, protected by its own paid officials, embedded in the ordinary daily life of the city. And that is precisely why it lasted so long. A legend passes through, a system stays. The men who truly ran the wide-open town were not the ones whose names ended up in American gangster movies. They were the ones whose names stayed out of the papers entirely, which was exactly how they wanted it. By now the reputation had a life of its own, and it reached far beyond the men who actually made the trip. Montreal had become a byword, a name spoken with a knowing smile across the whole of North America. The wicked city, the wide-open town, the place where the rules were suspended and the party never stopped. Newspapers wrote about it. Preachers denounced it, and every denunciation, every scandalized headline, only advertised it further, drawing the next wave of curious visitors north to see the sinful city for themselves. It was a strange kind of double life. To much of the continent, Montreal was a moral warning, an example of everything a decent city was supposed not to be. And to a great many of the very same people, privately, it was the most exciting weekend they could imagine. The city was condemned and desired in the same breath, and it profited handsomely from both. And underneath the reputation, the reality only deepened and organized itself further. The loose collection of operators from the early years hardened, over time, into something more structured and more permanent, more tightly bound to the great criminal organizations across the border, better able to protect itself and to endure. The wide-open town was not drifting toward chaos. It was drifting toward a kind of grim maturity, a well-run and well-defended criminal economy that had learned exactly how to survive inside a great city. And the better organized it became, the more completely it depended on the one thing that made all of it possible: the protection, the arrangement, the silence of the men in uniform, which meant that the entire structure, for all its money and all its power, still rested on a single fragile assumption that no one who mattered would ever decide to look. And a system that reaches into the police and the city government has one great weakness: it cannot survive scrutiny. As long as no one with real power was willing to look too closely, the arrangement was untouchable, and its greatest strength was simply the silence around it. But that silence was about to break, because the machine had finally grown too confident, and too visible, and too greedy, and it was about to run head-on into two men who could not be paid. If you are finding this one worth your time, Subscribing is what keeps these deep dives coming. We go inside another forgotten corner of Canada every week. Now, back to Montreal, and to the moment the arrangement began to come apart. The trouble, when it came partly from the underworld's own arrogance. For years, the violence of the rackets had mostly stayed in the shadows. Business settled quietly among the men who understood the rules. But as the money grew, so did the brazenness. And in the summer of 1946, the arrangement spilled its blood out into the open, in daylight, on a downtown street. Harry Davis, the gambling boss who had sat so long near the center of the machine, was shot dead outside one of his own establishments on a busy Central Avenue, gunned down over a dispute about who was allowed to operate and on whose say-so. A killing like that, in the heart of the city, was not something the newspapers could ignore or the public could shrug away. It was a signal, blunt and unmistakable, that the underworld had grown so powerful it no longer bothered to hide. And it fed a rising anger among the citizens of Montreal, who had long suspected what their city really was, and who were beginning to demand that someone, finally, do something about it. That anger needed a champion, and it found one in a most unlikely place. Inside the police force itself. Enter Pacifique Plante, a lawyer and policeman known to everyone as Pax, who had been given charge of the department's morality squad and had committed the cardinal sin of taking the job seriously. Plante actually did what the arrangement existed to prevent. He raided the gambling houses. He harassed the protected businesses. He treated the wide-open city as a crime scene rather than as a source of revenue. And for his trouble, he was pushed out, dismissed from the force. His career as a policeman ended by the very system he had tried to fight. But they had made a serious mistake in the man they chose to discard. Because Plante did not go quietly, he went to the newspapers. In a long series of articles that ran in a respected Montreal daily, Pax Plante laid the machine bare. He described, in relentless and specific detail, the network of gambling and prostitution that ran through the city, and above all the protection that shielded it. The payments, the complicity, the deliberate blindness of the men who were supposed to enforce the law. He wrote about the reign of the underworld over the city as a documented fact, not a rumor, mapping out how the whole thing actually functioned. It was a public accusation of extraordinary force, and it landed on a city that was finally ready to hear it. Plante had turned his own firing into a weapon, and he had given the reformers something they had always lacked, a detailed, credible, insider's account of exactly how the corruption worked, written by a man who had seen it from inside the police department. What he needed now was someone who could take that account into a courtroom and force the city to look at it under oath. And he found his partner in a young, ferociously determined lawyer who shared his conviction that the machine could be broken. Enter Jean Drapeau, a Montreal lawyer at the start of a career that would eventually make him the most famous mayor in the city's history. Drapeau joined forces with Plante, and with a committee of citizens formed for the express purpose of cleaning up the city. And together, they did something the machine had never faced before. They took it to law. They filed the legal actions and marshaled the evidence, and pressed, relentlessly, for a full public inquiry into the vice and the corruption that ran the wide-open town. And in 1950, after years of pressure, they got exactly what they had demanded. A judge of the Superior Court was appointed to conduct a sweeping public investigation into commercialized gambling, prostitution, and police protection in the city of Montreal. The doors of a courtroom opened, and for the first time, the arrangement was going to be dragged into the daylight and made to explain itself, under oath, in front of the whole city. Enter François Caron, the judge who would give the inquiry his name and preside over the slow, methodical dismantling of the machine. The Caron Inquiry ran for the better part of 4 years, an exhausting, patient procession of testimony that pulled the hidden workings of the city up into public view, one witness at a time. Hundreds of witnesses were called across those years. Policemen were summoned and questioned. Officials were put on the stand. The whole quiet economy of collection and protection, the thing that had been an open secret for a generation, was finally forced onto the record, sworn and documented, and impossible to wave away. Day after day, month after month, the inquiry traced the money and the arrangements and the deliberate failures, building a picture no one in authority could any longer pretend not to see. The two lawyers who had forced the inquiry into being, Plant and Drapeau, stood as its prosecutors, and it was Drapeau, above all, who became the relentless public face of the reckoning, questioning the witnesses, pressing the case, standing in that courtroom as the man determined to prove exactly how his city had been run. There was real drama in those hearings, and real risk. To stand up in Montreal and accuse its police and its officials of running a protected criminal economy was not a safe thing to do. These were powerful men with powerful friends, and a great deal to lose, and the two lawyers pressing the case were taking on the whole machine at once, in public, with their own names attached to every accusation. But the inquiry had a momentum the arrangement could not stop. Witness by witness, the picture assembled itself. The houses that had run untouched for years, the raids that had somehow always been tipped off in advance, the officers whose modest salaries could not begin to explain their comfort, the deliberate, systematic looking away that had allowed the whole thing to operate. What had been rumor and suspicion and the complaint of a handful of reformers was becoming, under oath and on the record, an undeniable account of how a great city had truly been governed. And the more it assembled, the more impossible it became to contain. A public that had half known the truth for years was now watching it proven in detail, day after day, and the outrage grew with every month of testimony. This was the one danger the machine had never been able to guard against. It could buy silence, and it could buy protection, but it could not survive being examined, calmly and relentlessly, in the full light of day. The arrangement had always depended on no one important being willing to look too closely. Now, someone was looking, for years on end, and writing down everything he found. And what the inquiry established, at the end of its long labor, was devastating. When the judge finally delivered his findings in the middle of the 1950s, he concluded that the vice of Montreal had flourished under a system of police protection, that officers and officials had shielded the gambling and the prostitution in exchange for the machine's money, or through a tolerance so deliberate it amounted to the same thing, and that the corruption the reformers had described was not the fantasy of cranks, but the documented reality of how the city had been policed. The consequences fell hard on the force. Senior figures were found to have failed catastrophically in their duty. Numerous officers were disgraced. The very head of the police force was among those brought down by the findings. The arrangement, the invisible thing that had made the wide-open city possible, had finally been named, proven, and punished in the full light of a public courtroom. But the inquiry did more than expose the machine. It made a hero, and it handed that hero the keys to the city. Because Jean Drapeau, the young lawyer who had helped force the whole reckoning into being, who had stood in that courtroom as the tireless prosecutor of the city's corruption, emerged from the affair as the most credible reformer in Montreal. He had promised to clean up the wide-open town, and in the most public way imaginable, over 4 years and hundreds of witnesses, he had proven he meant it. In 1954, running at the head of a new civic movement built on the promise of honest government, he was elected mayor of Montreal. The man who had exposed Sin City was now going to run it, and what he did with that power would remake the city entirely and quietly close the era we have been describing for good. Under the new order, the wide-open city began, at last, to close. The raids that Pax Plante had once conducted almost alone became policy. The most flagrant of the gambling houses were pushed out of business. The brothels of the old red light district came under a pressure they had never faced in all their tolerated years. The arrangement did not vanish overnight, and vice did not disappear from Montreal any more than it disappears from any great city on earth. But the thing that had defined the place, the open, unashamed, tolerated, protected sale of pleasure on an industrial scale, the machine that had made Montreal the sin city of a continent, was broken. The lights did not all go out at once, but one by one, the doors that had never closed began, finally, to shut. And here is where the great irony of the whole story comes fully into view, because the same forces that cleaned up the city were tangled together with the forces that would end its long reign as the metropolis of Canada. Jean Drapeau did not stop at closing the brothels. He set out to transform Montreal from a city famous for its sins into a city famous for its splendor, to put it on the world stage as a showcase of the modern age. He gave the city a gleaming subway system. He brought it a World's Fair in the 1960s that dazzled the entire planet and became the proudest moment in Montreal's modern history. A summer when the eyes of the world turned to the city and saw not a den of vice, but a vision of the future. A decade later, he brought it the Olympic Games. He tore down the image of the wide-open town and replaced it, deliberately and triumphantly, with the image of a gleaming, respectable, international city. And yet, across those very same decades, in which Montreal was scrubbing itself clean and dressing itself up for the world, its crown was slipping away. The city that had been the largest, richest, and most important in Canada for as long as anyone could remember was being quietly overtaken by its calmer, duller, steadier rival to the west. And then, in the 1970s, that slow decline turned into a rush. A wave of political upheaval and deep uncertainty swept through the province. The great corporate powers that had made Montreal the commercial heart of the country began to leave, and one of the most storied of them all, a giant insurance company that had stood as a pillar of the Montreal establishment for generations, announced that it was moving its head office west. Others followed. The exodus was about more than money. It was about a province remaking itself from the ground up. Across the 1960s and 70s, Quebec passed through a profound transformation, a reawakening of French-Canadian identity and ambition that changed the province forever and unsettled the old English-speaking establishment that had run its economy for generations. There was a great surge of nationalism, a period of political turmoil, even a spasm of political violence, and in time, the election of a government committed to making Quebec first and foremost a French society, with new laws to match. For many of the English-speaking corporations and the English-speaking families who had formed the commercial spine of Montreal, the ground had shifted beneath their feet, and a great many of them concluded that their future lay in the calmer, more predictable city to the west. Head offices moved. Families moved, capital moved, and with each departure, the rival city grew stronger, and Montreal grew a little smaller. In the national picture, it had once dominated completely. None of this was the fault of the men who had closed the brothels, and none of it followed from the cleanup in any direct way. But it belongs to the same chapter, the same stretch of decades in which Montreal stopped being the unquestioned first city of Canada and became, instead, one great city among others, proud and beautiful and diminished. The place had spent the roaring years as the exception, the wide-open metropolis that offered something no one else could. Now it was learning what it meant to be ordinary, to compete on the same terms as everywhere else, and, in the end, to lose. The banks, the corporations, the financial power that had made Montreal the first city of Canada drained steadily toward the rival in the west, which now became, permanently, the country's financial capital. The metropolis was being demoted, and it was happening in the same years its most famous mayor was showing it off to the world at a World's Fair and an Olympic Games. There is no simple, single line of cause and effect here. No one moment where the cleanup killed the city, because it did not. Montreal's decline as the country's first city had many fathers, deep economic and political and demographic ones, far larger than any question of vice. But the timing carries its own hard poetry. The generation that finally closed the wide-open town was the same generation that watched Montreal hand its crown to another city. The place had made itself the exception, the one town on the continent that stayed open when everyone else closed, and it had grown rich and famous and dangerous on that difference. And when it finally learned to close, to be respectable, to be clean, to be like everywhere else, it discovered that being like everywhere else was not enough to keep it first. So what remains today of the Sin City of North America? Walk the downtown now, and most of it is gone, cleared, and rebuilt, and forgotten. Much of the old red light district was demolished in the decades after the cleanup, its blocks of brothels and gambling houses swept away, and over a good part of that same ground, the city built something that could not be more different. Today, a large stretch of the old Vice Quarter has become a gleaming district devoted to festivals and the performing arts, a place of theaters and concert halls and vast summer crowds, high culture, standing precisely where the machine once ran its dice games and kept its houses. The transformation is almost too perfect to believe. The city took the very streets where it had sold its sins and turned them into a monument to its respectability. The underworld itself did not die, of course. It only changed its clothes. The organization that Vic Cotroni had built survived the cleanup and evolved, passing in time to new families and new bosses, moving out of the visible business of gambling houses and into the harder, quieter trades of the modern criminal economy. The protection did not end so much as go deeper underground, and the story of organized crime in Montreal would run on for generations, into construction and narcotics and the shadows of the city's politics, surfacing now and then in a fresh scandal or another public inquiry long after the neon of the wide-open town had been switched off. The machine did not stop. It simply learned to be invisible again, which is where it had always been most comfortable and where it had always done its best work. You can still trace the outline of that vanished world, if you know where to look. A few of the old buildings survive, repurposed and scrubbed of their history, their doorways giving no hint of what once ran behind them. Some of the streets that carried the trade are still there, renamed or rebuilt or absorbed into new districts, their reputations long since laundered. Here and there, a preserved facade or a lingering piece of local memory marks where a famous club once stood, where a notorious house once operated, where a body once fell on a busy afternoon. But the world itself, the living, breathing, sleepless machine of it, is gone almost without a trace, and the millions of visitors who pour through the modern city each year walk over its bones without ever knowing they are there. The city has been very thorough in its forgetting. That was, after all, the whole point of the cleanup, and of the long decades of respectability that followed it. Montreal did not merely close the wide-open town. It erased it, so completely that its own residents often struggled to believe it was ever real. And yet the shape of the story it left behind is unmistakable once you have seen it. The concentration of appetite and money and tolerance that a great port had gathered over centuries, the single foreign law that turned that appetite into an empire, the patient machine of protected crime that grew up to serve it, the reformers who finally dragged it into the light, and the strange, quiet demotion of the city that followed. It is all still there, written into the streets and the fortunes and the reputation of the place, legible to anyone willing to read it. And the strangest fate of all belongs to the reputation itself. Because the thing that a generation of reformers fought so hard to destroy, the image of Montreal as the wicked, wide-open, sinful city, did not die with the arrangement. It survived, and it softened, and it turned, at last, into nostalgia. Today, the city that once fought to bury its reputation as Sin City sells that reputation back to visitors as heritage and color and romance. the legend of the sleepless town, where anything was possible, the Paris of North America, marketed now as a charming chapter of the past, rather than the vast machine of protected crime it actually was. The sins that built the city, that the city then spent so much effort and so much moral energy erasing, have become, in the end, a part of the city's charm. So the story closes where it began, on the river, and the port, and the deep, old habit of a city that learned, in its very bones, how to sell what travelers wanted. Montreal became the wide-open capital of a continent because of where it sat and what it was, a wet and worldly island in a dry and Puritan land, a place of arrivals and appetites, where no single authority could ever quite impose its will. It grew rich and famous on that openness, built fortunes and legends on it, and ran, underneath the lights, on an arrangement of protected crime that reached into the heart of its own government. And when at last it tore that arrangement down, it found itself scrubbed clean and dressed for the world, just in time to lose the crown it had worn for 100 years. The whiskey is gone. The gambling houses are gone. The brothels of the old Main are gone. And the machine that connected them all has slipped deeper into the dark than the reformers ever managed to reach. The neon has been switched off, and the crown has passed to the west. What remains is a city that is still, in its heart, one of the great pleasure capitals of the continent, still sleepless, still worldly, still selling the promise of a night without limits, even if the men who once took a cut at every door have finally, mostly, learned to keep out of sight. Montreal was the exception, and for one long, bright, dangerous generation, being the exception was the most valuable thing in the world. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who would appreciate it, and subscribe if you have not already. We have more of these lost places and buried fortunes waiting, the boom towns and the sin cities and the great cities that history quietly left behind. We will see you inside the next one.